I think I'd like to start by talking about the things that Netflix got right and wrong about incels. And I know that this is a topic that you have been studying for quite a while now. Are you now doing your postdoc? Or is it your
No, I'm
doctoral
still
thesis?
PhD, so third year in my PhD, taking the scenic route.
Yeah. And you work with David Buss at his laboratory at the University of Austin, I know. And at the risk of deeply embarrassing you, David actually told me you were one of the best students he's ever had.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
I absolutely love David Buss's work as well, and I will link to some of that in the show notes. So first of all, what are some of the things that you think that adolescents got right?
So one thing I think it got very right is whether it's intentional or not, they very accurately depicted the kind of confusion that a lot of adults bring to this topic, to the incel topic, to the manosphere, to the troubles of young, very online teenagers that they're raising. So it depicted the adults, the detectives, the teachers, all being very confused, lumping incels in with Andrew Tate, all in one monolith. And I think that is very accurate of how adults approach this topic. I also think something that they did that was a bit more sophisticated is rather than having a character go down the rabbit hole of incel ideology, they kind of showed how incel ideology being around or even being able to be levied as an insult, as it was by the woman, the girl in the show that was bullying him, that he ended up killing. She called him an incel online, and a lot of friends liked that comment on Instagram. And this kind of public humiliation was the trigger for him to go confront her, which led to her being stabbed and killed. So the idea that a young boy of 13, the show talks about, well, every young boy at 13 is to some level or other an incel, right? They're not really expected to be very sexually active, but it shows that even a boy as young as 13, given the manosphere type content that's around now, feeling increasingly feeling pressure to present themselves as someone who is either currently somewhat sexually active or is the type of boy who is going to be. So in episode 3, it shows Jamie, the protagonist, having an interview with the psychiatrist, and he's at pains to show how a lot of bravado, showing how sexually successful he was and how far he had gone with girls, and really keen to prove his masculinity in this way. And I thought it was a bit bold of the writers of the show to depict the victim, the girl who ends up getting killed, as the bully. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
her, she was insulting him about being incel, and that the implication was he was going to be a virgin for life. So I thought it was a realistic depiction of how some violence like this might unfold, a tragedy like this. But we have to be very clear that if a tragedy like this unfolded, it would be it would be a huge outlier in terms of a young 13-year-old boy, never been in trouble before, getting on well in school, has friends, stumbles upon having a knife, is humiliated online publicly, feels like he has to confront the girl, and things get out of hand. So that is kind of a plausible depiction of what might happen, but it would be a huge outlier. Like the writers of the show have said that they were inspired by the epidemic of knife violence in the UK. Now, this is what they depicted in the show is not prototypical of knife violence in the UK at all. There is no epidemic of manosphere-inspired violence among young people in the UK or anywhere. So it just simply isn't an epidemic on that level. I would wager that there is an epidemic of knife violence, but you can draw a straight line of causality from something like drill music far easier than you can from manosphere ideology. So it was a
What
bit.
is drill music?
So drill
Sorry.
music, if you're not familiar, it's kind of like a mix between rap and grime, but very linked with gang culture. So there's literally examples of teenagers or young, typically black adults in London stabbing and killing each other and then writing a drill music song about it. And that's kind of
Mm.
they're encouraged to do this. And you can actually quantify the body count associated to that. subgroup or culture in a way that you can't with Manosphere. So it was an unusual decision. And I know the writers of the show, I don't want to hold their feet to the fire too much for having to be hyper realistic in their portrayal. But when they're claiming that this is kind of inspired by the epidemic of knife violence, then I think they have an onus to be accurate. They have even more of an onus to be accurate when the show is now being brought up in Parliament and the Prime Minister is describing it as a documentary. We have the leader of the opposition being raked over the coals on radio because she hasn't seen it. There's plans to roll it out. It aired 17 days ago, by the way. And in that time, it has become Netflix's most watched miniseries of all time. And it's on track to become one of their most watched shows of all time, period. And now there are plans, government-backed plans, to show it in every school in the UK. Now, there could be no evidence to show that this type of intervention would be effective to challenge a problem, like I say, is kind of fictitious in the first place. So there's a lot, it's really taken on a life of its own, and it's escalating at a crazy pace. And I think everyone needs to take a little bit of a perspective, because policy decisions on any topic should be based on sober research rather than a really highly emotive piece of performance art, no matter how powerful that piece of performance art is.
Yeah, absolutely. And my feeling about it is, having seen it, it's a very beautifully shot. So each episode, or actually, I don't know anything about filmmaking, so I may be wrong when I say this, but it feels as though it was shot in one long take. So it doesn't have these kind of jump cuts where you switch from one scene to another. And that makes it feel very immersive. And I think that might be part of that, just that technique might be part of what's confusing Keir Starmer when several times he's described it as a documentary, which I don't excuse his confusion. He's the prime minister, so he ought to get his shit together, you know,
Yes.
and be a bit more thoughtful and well informed when he's commenting on things, especially something that is potentially as explosive, emotive and explosive as this. But nevertheless, I think that impression that has clearly entered his head somehow that it's a documentary maybe partly comes from just that filming technique, and also the extraordinary talent of the actors involved. The father, who is, I forget the name of the actor, but he's
Stephen Graham. Yeah, he's the writer as
Stephen
well.
Graham, right? And he is I I have seen him in other things, and he has the classic feel of a Shakespearean trained BBC actor. Just very absolute joy to watch him at work. And I mean, all the actors in it were tremendous, and especially the young boy was just incredible. And the actor, I believe, was 14 when he was filming the series. He plays a 13-year-old, and he was only 1 year older himself. He's just turned 15 now. And that was his first time ever acting for TV, I believe. Just completely extraordinary. I did speech and drama at age 14. I got a distinction in my grade 8, which is the highest grade. And there is absolutely no way that I could have given any kind of TV performance that was even like a 1% as convincing as that.
Yes.
I just declaimed Shakespeare in a hammy voice and things like that. So I'm very struck by partly how skilled the production was, and also just how powerful stories are. And I think part of the problem here is the Stalin thing, which is one death is a tragedy and a million deaths are a statistic. And everybody is, or many people are caught up in the one story, in the tragedy, whereas you are going to talk statistics for us and bring us a bit more back down to earth from
Yeah, so
this
just
suspension of disbelief that's
yeah,
happened.
yeah. Just a couple of things to kind of pick up on what you said. Yes, I totally agree with the extraordinary acting that was on show from everyone involved, but particularly Owen Cooper, the young actor whose first role it was. I think when you say about what a plausible depiction he gave of an angry young teenager, but I think it's the plausibility of that anger. He's very typical of an angry young teen in his scene with the psychiatrist, and that is probably relatable to anyone who's worked in schools in the UK. You recognize this antagonistic young boy who oscillates between extreme anger, a little bit of insecurity, smugness, adversarialness. He's just completely natural of how they actually behave when they're confronted with an authority figure. They try and create rapport with you, and then they push you away. It was very typical of the anger of young men, I found. So that might have been easy enough for him to tap into, because it's very that bit is prototypical. It is interesting, and I don't want to get him in too much trouble here, but Stephen Graham, one thing that isn't really talked about much is he very recently got in trouble himself for a little bit of toxic masculinity. He actually got arrested, I think, for attacking a referee or verbally abusing a referee at a soccer game. And there's interviews where he discusses that. So that's kind of interesting that he has a trajectory to create a show about ostensibly toxic masculinity. But yeah, so in terms of statistics, in terms of incel violence alone, there has been a handful of attacks, and 59 people around the world are estimated to have lost their lives in instances of ideologically motivated incel violence. Now, that is very, very small in comparison to almost any other extremist group. So just in terms of quantifying how much of a problem this is in terms of the physical violence, that's one thing. Manosphere type inspired violence like depicted in the show, I'm not aware of a single case. So that's the extreme level of the violence. Now, this is a pervasive problem that teachers in the UK are talking about. They're saying, this manosphere, this Andrew Tate stuff, we don't know how to handle it, and we need guidance or whatever it is. But to quantify some statistics on how popular manosphere type stuff is, I can just pull it up for you. There's a study done by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which are quite a woke organization, I would say. And they asked the question of young boys in Britain how popular they thought Andrew Tate was. And they broke it down by racial demographics too. So in terms of his popularity, let me just read it for you now. 15% of white respondents viewed him as positive. That's Andrew Tate. 31% of Asian respondents viewed him positively. And I should clarify that Asian in the UK context would mean South Asian, like Pakistani or Indian, rather than East Asian, like Korean or Japanese. And 41% of black respondents viewed him positively. So not only is Jamie not typical of knife crime in the UK, but he's not even typical of manosphere fans. So that's kind of an interesting statistical breakdown.
Yeah, I would say I can say this since I'm half Pakistani, but when I think of an incel, young Indian men come to mind. I immediately assume they would be overrepresented, and part of that is Indian culture is extremely repressive of young people's sexuality, and so a lot of young men don't have the kind of in India itself don't have the kind of dating opportunities that we have in the West. And we see a lot of really dysfunctional behaviors as a result.
Yeah, so just to add on that specifically regarding incel research, we find an overrepresentation of ethnic minorities there also. So in our recent study, which is the largest incel study in the world so far, it's an exclusively US and UK sample, and we found 42% of our sample were a person of color. So that's an overrepresentation. So although most were white, there was an overrepresentation of ethnic minorities among incels.
Yeah. So in what other ways is he not typical? So first of all, most incels aren't violent. That's the first thing that you talked about. The number of deaths from incel violence is really low. And my kind of rough impression from reading David Buss's work and talking to David Buss is that when we think about men who are violent with sexual motivations towards women. So in this case, there was no rape or sexual assault that happened. But if we're talking about sexual assaults, rapes, attacks, etc., the perpetrator is less likely to be your Aspergery, shy, socially inept, incel type living in his mother's attic who has never had a girlfriend and who is assaulting or raping the woman out of a kind of desperation to get sex or a kind of revenge against women for rejecting him, and much more likely to actually be a guy who is successful, attractive, can actually get plenty of partners who will sleep with him consensually, but who has an attitude of entitlement and who is also high in dark triad personality traits, narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. And therefore, it's less about kind of you're so desperate for sex that you're going to go and rape someone, and more about you are the kind of person who feels everything is owed to you, and because of your sociopathic personality, you want to have sex with whatever women you want, whether or not they're up for it. Is that a
Yes.
fair distinction?
Yes, that's right. So it's an intuitive hypothesis which was called the mate deprivation hypothesis of rape, which describes, like you say, that sex deprived men would force women to have sex with them as their only means to get sex. But in actual fact, most sexual violence is from mates or dates. So people who are already partnered with the person actually forcing their own partner into sex, which for many years wasn't even classified as rape, which is terrible. But that's actually a large portion of sexual violence. Or dates who just refuse to take no when there's the perception of a sexual opportunity on the cards. And like you say, these high dark triad men who cannot perceive that the woman wouldn't want it, so they end up pushing things too far and force the sex. Yeah, incels are very quick to point out that women are actually far more at risk of being harmed by the partners they choose than sexless incels who are kind of online all the time and not really interacting with women that much. So yeah, that is a misconception that's good to clarify. But on the autism
Yeah.
thing, it's an important point you raise. So we find in our recent data that there's an extraordinary overrepresentation of autism among incels. So it's likely that roughly 30% of incels have autism. So to talk you through some statistics, 18% of incels self-report that they have a diagnosis. That's in other research, not ours. But in our recent data, we used what's called the AQ10 scale, which is a scale to measure whether someone should go for a referral for an autism diagnosis with a clinician. And the guidance on this measure is that people who score 6 out of 10 or above on the scale would go for a referral, and roughly 80% of those will go on to receive a diagnosis. Now, by that metric, roughly 30% of our sample would meet the criteria to be sent for a referral. The estimates of it's a ballpark figure of roughly 18 to 30% that likely have autism.
How does that compare with the proportion of autism in the general population?
So in America, young men, it's between 2 to 3%, roughly, 1 to 3%.
So they're massively overrepresented.
Massively
What,
overrepresented, yeah.
so you were talking about the racial breakdown of the autists, which is also massively um, Black men and Indian, Pakistani, Asian men are massively overrepresented in the UK. There are similar stats for the US.
So that study that I'm talking about is a US and UK
Oh, that's
sample.
the
So
UK.
it's a
Okay.
mix of the two. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And is there also a socioeconomic component to it? Are these more likely to be impoverished, come from impoverished families or single parent families, or what's the socioeconomic background of most incels?
So a lot of incels report to be roughly 18% of our recent data reported to be NEET, so not in education, employment, or training. We didn't actually measure the fatherlessness or single parent household nature, which is something I want to do in the future because a lot of people comment that they think fatherlessness might play a big part, or single parent households. But yeah, they're kind of opting out of society. They're not very high achieving, not very motivated. Kind of the whole culture of incels is very nihilistic. And I actually recently reviewed a paper which found that a big part of the discourse in their online forums is about dropping out of work, don't participate in society that they see as hates them, which is how they think. So they don't really want to, they feel like they don't benefit from society. So there is a lot of this discourse to kind of encourage each other to back out of society.
To be clear, when you're talking about incels, you don't just mean a man who happens to have difficulty finding a girlfriend, because not every man who has difficulty finding a sex or a relationship would think of himself or describe himself as an incel. This has become a kind of victimhood identity group. Do you feel that it's almost like part of victimhood culture? There's a kind of a kind of status, or at least a sort of bonding to be gained from identifying as an incel, that it just means not only do you not have a girlfriend now and it's been a while, but it also presupposes that your chances are very low
Mm-hmm.
of ever getting into a relationship in the future. So it has this kind of um, doomerist mentality.
Yeah, yes, I very much think it's a mindset because, and yes, most of our studies that I'm describing are people who self identify with the subculture. They would refer to themselves as incel. But to be clear, some of the findings also apply to involuntarily single men, whether they've ever heard of the incel subculture or not. So the poor mental health would apply, and the misogyny, actually. There's some studies to show that it's low mate value men that are most misogynistic. And the way my supervisor, David Buss, describes this is women seem wicked when you're unwanted, as Jim Morrison of The Doors wrote in a song lyric. And I think that kind of totally taps into it. It's misogyny is most concentrated in low mate value men, whether they're in the relationship or outside of the relationship. So low mate value men in relationships, they inflict misogynistic costs on their partner to try and retain them, to try and lower their self-esteem. And I kind of hypothesize that outside of the context of a relationship, that's what incels are trying to do. And I kind of see their strategy as a bit more, even more sophisticated than that. So I hypothesize that they're engaging in what I call coordinated condemnation. So they're trying to encourage other men to participate in this misogyny too, so they can cultivate this sense of consensus in the woman that she is lower mate value than she thinks. They spend a lot of time talking to each other rather than directly to women. So it's almost like they're proselytizing this philosophy that they want other men to engage in, which will, the aim is to collectively lower women's self-esteem and thus their mating standards, because it only really works if you do it in numbers. Because if you are the only guy who's misogynistic, it's easy to dismiss you as the only asshole and you incur a lot of reputational costs. But if you can cultivate this sense of consensus among women that, oh, wow, maybe my choice of choosing Chad is wrong. Maybe my choice of waiting until I hit the wall is wrong. All of their misogyny seems almost functionally designed specifically to try and get women to lower their standards. So that's one thing. And they also in tandem might be a mating strategy of trying to encourage their competition to opt out and take the black pill. So mostly incels communicate in pseudo-anonymous forums. So we don't know. Now, I do think they buy into their own ideology, but there is potentially a subset of men who are anonymously talking to lots of other low mate value men and trying to encourage them to take the black pill and opt out of the mating market. So if you have those two strategies in tandem, if you're a free rider, so to speak, you can kind of piggyback on that. It's other men are lowering women's self-esteem with this consensus of misogyny, and other men are opting out of the mating market. You've all arranged this or participated in it anonymously. So off screen, you can perhaps benefit from this. But I do think incels typically buy into their own ideology, but you don't have to be conscious of these strategies for them to actually be functional or what's happening. So sometimes self-deception is the best way to actually deceive other people. That's kind of how it works. So there are just some ideas I have about how the misogyny might be functioning. But you mentioned a really important point that I often ask incels in qualitative interviews with them, how would you know you're no longer an incel? What would have to change? Would you have to get one girlfriend, have sex one time? How would you know? And they often talk about it like it's alcoholism, like they might have a relapse into this mindset again. So I had a very interesting back and forth with the admin of the main incel forum. And I wasn't trying to antagonize him. I really wanted to understand this. But I've noticed a bit of a Mott and Bailey style shift in their rhetoric. So originally they would propose that physically unattractive men can never form relationships. And that is just patently absurd. Like, if you look around you, you see physically unattractive men with
Yeah.
wives and kids all the time. And so it's demonstrably false. So they've shifted the position now to being, actually, they may be able to attract a partner, but they'll never be able to cultivate genuine desire. And that's a totally different claim and a massively unfalsifiable one. I mean,
Yeah.
you can pick up on cues that you're inspiring genuine desire, and I hope we are, but one never knows, right? For sure. So, it's a totally different claim, but it belies the mindset that nothing would ever actually be enough. So it speaks to a larger problem, that what happens to these incels who ascend, as they call it, when they're no longer an incel? Do they retain some of these misogynistic beliefs? What kind of partners do they become? And I'm interested in that trajectory, because there is maybe a way to study this, because there's a forum called Incel Exit, where former incels talk about their experiences and how they exited the mindset. But it is interesting to wonder what happens, whether they relapse into the thinking again, whether they, and I put up a Twitter poll or an X poll about this, asking men and women how often they have feelings that they're not good enough for their partner, or that their partner wishes they were with someone else. And it was a non-trivial sum of both men and women, more men, but that's perhaps unsurprising given my following. But yeah, it perhaps is a more pervasive problem than I thought. But I kind of think, if you're incel, surely that's still better than nothing, right? I mean, you can never be sure that your partner isn't holding a candle for some other long lost flame. You can't be sure. You can't live your life like that, thinking, oh, they prefer someone else. But that kind of speaks to the pathology of the incel mindset.
Yeah, I think that if your self-esteem is low enough for long enough, then there is this phenomenon in general where if someone seems to like you, you ask yourself, well, they can't really like me, so therefore they must have some ulterior motive. They must be after me for some other reason. It must be transactional in some way, purely transactional.
Yeah, and that
And
fits with a
yeah,
lot of the incel personality. So, like you say, they're very high on victimhood, they're very high on rejection sensitivity, they're very suspicious of women. So, you've got a real cocktail there: low self esteem, they perceive themselves as low mate value. So, it's a cocktail there of precisely what you described.
we should mention that in Adolescence itself, that sort of strategy of trying to lower the woman's self-esteem is thematized. So the young woman who is killed, who we never learn much about, which is really interesting, and I thought a very interesting dramatic choice. They don't try to let us know anything much about her, except for the fact that she seems to be a little bit of a bully, but she's only 13. So, I mean, 14. How much can you blame her for really any behavior? But we don't get any humanizing details about her. She is just completely off screen. And the one thing that we do hear is that she showed her breasts. I don't even understand how you have breasts at that age already, but um to some boy, he took photos, and then he showed the photos to his friends as a kind of revenge porn. And the protagonist, Jamie, says that that was the moment at which he decided to ask her out,
Mm-hmm.
because he reckoned that he would stand a better chance because her self-esteem would be very low at that moment.
Yes, he describes her as, I thought she might describe herself as weak at that moment. And
Mm,
that's precisely
mm.
how I hypothesize this misogyny kind of functions, is that you cash in on someone else's misogyny when her self esteem, her sense of her own mate value might be low, and you swoop in and avail of her lower standards. That's almost precisely how I hypothesize it functions. So it's very interesting to see it picked up on, I presume unintentionally, by the writers. Maybe they're
Mm.
evolutionary psychologists and came to the same theory as me.
One thing that is thematized in Adolescence, which might also be more accurate, even though I want to avoid suggesting that adolescence is accurate in most ways. There certainly shouldn't be a moral panic about this. There is absolutely no epidemic of incel violence. And in fact, Jamie is not even a typical incel. But one thing that I think is perhaps accurately depicted in the film, I was very much in the position of the detective, in that the lead detective, who is a fabulous actor. But one thing that's depicted is the greater pressures that are put on young people because they are so online. So the bullying takes place online on Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
and much of it is in the form of emojis. So the detective doesn't even understand that these emojis are bullying, but it's coded. It's like a modern kind of hieroglyphics, I often think, the way that
Yeah,
we've returned from words to sort of symbols. Like on Twitter, you can
yes,
just
but
post a photo and people will know what meme you're referring to. Can post a
yes,
couple in bed and they're turned away with their backs to each other, and you know that meme is, I bet he's thinking about other women, and in fact the guy's thinking about something totally geeky. And
mm-hmm.
you no longer even need the thought bubbles now. You can just post this meme as a response. You can just
Yes.
post the photo itself. And the emojis are like a highly concentrated form of that kind of emotive hieroglyphics. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how online life is affecting this phenomenon in general, and whether this is something that is adding to the pressure that young people feel and young men feel to be sexually desirable and sexually chosen.
Yeah, so a couple of things to say there. There's a reason why the emoji part specifically might have been very alienating or confusing to you, Iona, because it's not based on anything. I've been
But it's
studying
not.
incels for a long time. I've never seen any of this. Apparently, some of
Okay.
the emojis, the purple heart does mean kind of horny or something, but this is not. And there is a core lexicon of incel online language trolling lingo. They have a term for everything that's often quite comical. But the emoji thing is just absolutely absurd. I don't know where they got it.
Okay.
And
Good. I'm not so
I've
out of
heard,
touch.
oh no, not at all. You're very online, Iona. That's the problem actually. But no, I do agree with you that they are very online. They do have their trolling language, but the emojis, this hidden language of it that parents need to watch out for. That's absurd. I've never seen any of that.
Okay.
So that's a weird choice by the writers. And I've heard apparently in another interview that the young actor Owen Cooper had to actually correct the writers and tell them to take some of the stuff out that they were trying to include on this kind of emoji line. So that is a weird one. But yes,
Mm.
the larger point of the very online nature of life for teenagers now is an important one. So, like you said, the bullying takes place online, and Instagram and the ability to ratchet up likes and the appearance of consensus about, oh, the whole year group approves of me calling you an incel. The choice of insult itself to derogate a young man's ability to be sexually selected is an interesting one. And I think we'll all intuitively understand that incel functions as an insult to people now. I've heard even Elon Musk be called an incel, or Andrew Tate, which is kind of
He has
ludicrous.
so many kids.
Right, yes. I don't know how they come to that conclusion, but it kind of demeans the term, which is annoying. But yes, in our research, we do find that incels report a lot of bullying. So 60% of incels, roughly 60%, report childhood bullying, compared to roughly 30% of people in the general population. And you do have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because incels are very performative, very victimhood oriented, and very rejection sensitive. So in their forums, they have some forums which are called Rage Fuel, which they all put in instances from their day-to-day life where they perceive they've been slighted. So, for example, they might describe that they jumped into an elevator and an attractive woman was in there and she had a look of pure disgust on her face. And it probably didn't happen that way, but they're perceiving this rejection. But by the same token, we recently published a paper which had some interesting findings that incels massively over perceive the animosity that society has for them and underestimates the sympathy they have for them. Now, that wasn't true specifically for female feminists. They actually did have the animosity that incels perceive and did have the low levels of sympathy that incels perceive. But these are refreshing findings from my point of view, that incels are wrong about the idea that society overwhelmingly hates them. But by the same token, in our paper, I had to couch our findings with the very real hostility that incels do face. So, in my opinion, they're one of the only groups that you could go online and open fire and say the most hurtful thing you can imagine, and you would probably be applauded by a large portion of the online world. There are even forums dedicated to bullying incels. There's a forum called Incel Tier, and basically the whole idea of the forum is for people to give examples of how they've bullied incels and made them cry, incel tears. So that bullying got so bad that the forum, Incel Tier, had to instantiate a rule, and the number one rule is no more encouraging suicide of incels in their forum. And when you consider the extraordinarily high levels of suicidal ideation among incels, roughly 20% of incels in our recent data said they thought about suicide or self-harm every day over the last 2 weeks. A further 33% said they thought about it several days or more than half the days. So that's extraordinarily high compared to 5% of the general population who think about suicide have a suicidal thought within the year. So it's a massive problem in this community. So they do incur real bullying, and there is a wide literature on lookism. Incels aren't wrong about that attractive people are preferred and given preferential treatment in a lot of ways that shouldn't really pertain to their attractiveness, and ugly people or less physically attractive people are discriminated against. There's a wide literature on that. Francesca Minerva has spearheaded that line of research. So I thought that was important for us to include in those findings, because I didn't want incels to read our work and just think, oh, this normie, he's just pretending like we don't receive hostility from society. I'm very aware that they do.
Gosh, there's so many different aspects of this that I want to go into. I think one good place to start might be Andrew Tate, who is alluded to in Adolescence, although, as you said, we don't see the character going down a rabbit hole. Although at one point the parents do say that one indication that something might have been wrong was that he spent a lot of time in his room online, which I'm a bit concerned about parents of boys watching that, because all my friends who have sons of that age, they spend a lot of time in their rooms online, and they're not necessarily consuming Andrew Tate or likely to knife any young girls or anything like that. That's just how kids choose to spend their free time nowadays. So he might have been in those times when he was online. I think the implication is that he might have been consuming manosphere content. First of all, how popular is Tate? Also, what do you think his appeal is? Can you steel man a little bit the appeal of Andrew Tate to young men, especially to young men who are having difficulties attracting women? And also maybe say a bit about what might be an effective way of countering the Tate ideology, because the ways that I see suggested, like I think Keir Starmer was suggesting we should have anti-misogyny lessons in schools, which I think is a terrible, terrible idea, that some young female teacher is going to be lecturing the boys on how to respect women. That just sounds awful. But I mean, it sounds awful because I think it would be counterproductive at best, if not just kind of completely ignored. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Tate and similar ideologies specifically.
Yeah, so like I said at the top of the show, his popularity is fairly low among white boys in England, raises in popularity for Asian boys, and even more again for black boys. So there is a racialized component to his popularity specifically, but his appeal to young men, not really that confusing. He offers to tell them how to get a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of women, a lot of sex, a lot of fast cars. He seems to have a lot of fraternity with his brother and friends, a lot of strong cohesion there. He absolutely makes total sense why that's appealing to young men. What I think there might be some area of promise for intervention is in this idea of a credible role model. So I totally agree with you that these anti-misogyny lessons would backfire. So I'll give a little anecdote. When you're in school, it's actually kind of cool to be considered a bit of a bad boy, right? I don't know if this is a crazy news breaking story to people, but just a personal anecdote. I remember we were on a school tour in Rome. I was in an all boys Irish school. and we were in a hotel, and there was another all-girls school. So you can imagine this was to our great excitement. And I managed to find my hands on a pellet gun. And the girls' school was having their assembly outside, and I'll confess a personal sin here. We started shooting the legs of the girls with the pellet gun from our hotel window. Now, at that time, I'm not condoning this, but the best thing in the world for us happened is that the nun who was in charge of the girls' school caught us, and she decided to march us out in front of the entire girls' school and make us apologize for our bad behavior. Whoa, you can imagine how popular we were the whole rest of the school tour. So these things would absolutely backfire. It's not a good strategy. What is a more effective strategy, I think, is to have credible role models. So there's an interesting developmental trajectory to pickup artists. So there's a few high profile examples of Neil Strauss, Dan Bilzerian, Tucker Max. They climb the mountaintop and succeed in the pickup artist short-term mating oriented world, and they figure out, whoa, it's actually not that fulfilling. Here's what's more fulfilling, and a family life, and they change direction completely. And that's pretty reliable. And nobody can say, oh, well, they don't understand what it's like. They absolutely have to be considered a credible role model, because this idea of the male feminist kind of cool new masculinity role model being marched out in front of students in school, I think they're just going to be rejected. So I'll give another example. I was watching Irish television discuss adolescence with a panel of experts and young people in the audience, and they very much had the polarized old school traditional masculinity guy on one side and the neo-masculinity male feminist with a man bun and kind of reinventing masculinity on the other side. And they asked the question, what does masculinity mean to you? And the old school guy said, it's about protecting the people in my life, and just kind of bread and butter old school masculinity stuff. Bit old fashioned, but whatever. They asked the male feminist guy, the man bun guy, and he said, I would hate to think that my masculinity is about protecting the women in my life. And the camera just pans to the audience, and it's kind of young women, and they go like that with their face.
Yeah.
They're just like disgusted by this. So I think you can reinvent masculinity, but there are limits. If the women in the audience or women in the world are going to reject your neo-masculinity, then I don't think it's going to catch on. So there are some that I would point to, and I'm going to unashamedly champion my own friend here in Austin, Chris Williamson. He's would be absolutely considered a credible role model, but he uses his platform and influence to motivate young men to do things like he quits alcohol for 1,000 days. He is now encouraging young men to go get their sperm checked, to take their health seriously, to manage their productivity, to get in touch with their mental health. He's absolutely someone we should champion, in my opinion. So it's kind of really depressing when I see other people try and kind of lump him in with manosphere when there's a massive distance between Andrew Tate and him. So I think the days of this kind of woke agenda of saying gym culture, gym bros are all far right, we have to let that go, because you're going to alienate young men so hard if you keep up with that.
Yeah, we interviewed, so for the other Quillette podcast, Quillette Cetera, which Zoe Booth runs, she interviewed Mike Israetel, who's a gym bro and kind of, I consider him a sort of masculinity influencer, again, in a good way. So I'll put a link to that, again, the show notes, which will be on if you're watching this on YouTube, the show notes will be on the Quillette.com site. And yeah, I felt that with the Jordan Peterson stuff as well. So back in the day when Jordan Peterson was very active as a kind of influencer of young men, even though I am not really a big Peterson fan. I dislike a lot of his work and I hated Maps of Meaning. That's like a day of my life that I will never get back. But he was, in the way that he addressed young men, was actually very positive, I felt, because he said, if women don't like you, stop complaining about women. It's your fault. You need to work on yourself. And I found that a very empowering message that discourage this kind of wallowing in victimhood, which can be so toxic. And yet there were a lot of people describing that as kind of misogynistic or far right. It's like, well, are you not going to allow people to have any sort of masculinity or any kind of male influencers talking to them about what it means to be a man? Because that just seems very, very counterproductive.
Yeah, the relationship between Jordan Peterson and incels also speaks to the confusion of a lot of journalists or people on this topic, because he was described as the incel king. And that was kind of very confusing to those of us who were close to the topic, because, like you say, his message to incels is pick yourself up by your bootstraps, bucko. That's classic bread and butter Jordan Peterson advice, but it maybe is what they need to hear. And, Jordan Peterson in 2016, 2017, listening to him made me take myself seriously for the first time in a long time, and my developmental arc has been skyrocketing since then. It's really effective, and that's the case for a lot of young men. He seems to speak, or he seemed to back then anyway, speak to men in a language that they hear, and that's really important. That's what a lot of people are saying is difficult. I also really liked when Piers Morgan challenged him on his show. He said to Jordan, what about these incel losers, these weirdos online? Are you their king? Are you the incel king? And Jordan Peterson got quite emotional and said, sure, why not? Aren't the marginalized supposed to have a voice? And he welled up and, in classic Peterson style, started crying. But I thought it was actually heartfelt, because he challenged the kind of the punching down to incels that is just par for the course now. And he said, these young men, they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women, and they should get some help. And don't women want to have attractive partners? So I think, yeah, he'd be a really useful voice on it. And I really love listening to the old school Jordan Peterson clinical psychology kind of guidance. That's when I thought he was at his best. So if people are interested to look back at his old school videos.
Yeah, I love the one that he did on alcoholism, for example. Fantastic. Yeah, how much is so what are the factors that are stopping these men from finding girlfriends? Apart from just the kind of victimhood culture, which is not going to help because that discourages that discourages striving for self-improvement. But one thing that I noticed is that when I see incel sort of discourse, not on forums, but just on Twitter and things, there's a lot of, first of all, there's a real failure of theory of mind about women. So there's this meme, for example, which shows a woman who has 40 men queued up to have sex with her. It's like Isla's birthday party. It's one of the men, like number 20th in the queue, is in a suit and has a brief. All the others are in their tighty whities, and he's in a suit with a briefcase and carrying a bunch of roses. And it's like, the women who are attractive, they're just going to be shagging everything that moves. And that's a kind of, the ability to be shagging everything that moves is more of a male fantasy than a female fantasy. Most women wouldn't want that. Most women would cut straight to the guy with the briefcase, and no matter how many other men wanted to have sex with them. So there's a failure of theory of mind, and there's also a kind of presumption that it's all about looks. And there is, to me, this somewhat contradictory thing, which is most women find most men unattractive, but nevertheless, most men are in relationships, including some really rough-looking guys. I mean, I live in Australia, and the Australian sun is not kind to the skin of men's skin. There are some really rough-looking guys, and those guys are most of those guys though have a girlfriend or are married, have kids, or some of them are divorced, which implies they did have a long-term relationship and kids. So it seems that at least over the longer term, things balance out and women settle or come to kind of relax their standards in a natural way, not unforced. So if I'm correct that it's not about looks, what do you think the main factors are? Is it the autism that is the main disabling thing for them?
Well, the autism is certainly a contributing factor for those that have it. But the idea of the mindset of incels and their failure of cross sex mind reading is a hugely important factor. So they infer the mind of the other sex with their own sexual mind. So they think there's no such thing as a femcel because most women could go out and get sex if they want. It just might not be the exact sex that they want. But for women, that's not a privilege, right? It's like you'd rather have no sex than sex you don't want. For men, sex is like pizza. There's good pizza and there's pizza. There's no bad pizza. But for women, there really is bad pizza, right? There's bad sex. It's worse than nothing. But incels don't see it. They're very kind of blunt in their analysis. No, some is always better than none. And they can't figure it out. So, yes, they also, one thing that's interesting, they, in terms of their mating psychology, they police what they see as simping from other men. So simping is being overly generous to women and basically paying too high a price for sex. So similar to how women police the promiscuity of other women because they have to behave like cartel around sex, because if all the women in your social milieu are giving sex away cheaply, you have to compete at that level as well. So similarly, on the other side, if a lot of men are willing to be sugar daddies, pay for women all the time on dates and pay for them to fly out across the world, incels really hate this because it's inflating the price that they think men have to pay. So that's interesting. There's cartel dynamics going on between both sexes. But yeah, incels, they really think it's all about looks. And to give them a little bit of credit, this may be coming from their very online nature. So there is huge evidence that online dating apps prioritize physical attractiveness way above and beyond. It's basically one of the only data points that's doing all the heavy lifting in the online dating domain. So if increasingly the online dating apps are the arena, then incels are kind of right. And there is some studies to show that incels specifically struggle at creating a dating app profile and in online dating specifically. So that could be an area for intervention, because I kind of have a hunch that most men, not just incels, are not really great at making online dating app profiles. I think one good thing you could do as a man is probably farm that work out to a really good close female friend who you trust, who's not going to lie to you, and let her kind of build your profile with you. But that's another thing. Having opposite sex friendships and having offline friendships in general, it's no secret that a lot of men use their opposite sex friendships as mating opportunities themselves, but also to meet other women too. Certainly growing up, that was how you met women. It was like, whose cousin is in town? You know, you could get the invite to a party, and that's how your social group grew. But if incels are only navigating the dating market in an online world, and they're physically unattractive, which they probably are to some degree, then they are likely to lose in that world. So it is interesting that, yeah, the increasingly how the mating market being increasingly funneled towards online worlds may be actually putting them at a disadvantage, because it doesn't allow for any other personality traits to compensate for your physical unattractiveness, which is what needs to happen. But I recently, there's an account on Twitter called, or on X, called Nuance Enjoyer. I don't know who he really is, but he always has very good content. And he spoke about, or posted about, how it's actually probably easier to change your looks than your whole personality. It's not that easy to just cultivate a winning personality out of nowhere if you don't have it to begin with. And it's a lot easier to cultivate a winning personality when you're physically attractive. So he said, actually, it probably is a lot easier for incels to Looksmaxx than change their core personality. And it's kind of tempting for us to think, oh, it's not about your looks, it's about your awful personality. But yeah, they may have bad looks and also bad personality, and it's not just simple.
Well, it won't hurt, especially now you can hit the gym, and especially now we have Ozempic. I keep saying that because of Ozempic, laser hair removal, HRT, and Viagra, my generation will be the first generation who can go sexy into our old age.
Nice timing.
We have the technology. We have the technology now. Yeah, exactly. Perfect timing for me. I'm kind of an incel myself at the moment, doing the dating apps, and I just want to really stress for any guy who's out there, please write something in your profile. If you don't want to be judged just on your looks, then you need to actually fill out the profile. And do not fill it out with, I'm just an ordinary guy the same as everybody else. You will be surprised by how many people write that.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I like all the usual things. I don't know what to say. I'm just ordinary. That is not going to help, especially if you don't look that great. Get a female friend to write your profile for you.
Yes.
I think that one of the things with the incel community, the victimhood that I often think about is when there's a culture, in general, there's a culture among women of being, I feel, often overly supportive. If a woman were to say to her female friends, do you think I'm a bit overweight? All her friends would be like, no, you look amazing. Whereas if a guy were to say that, well, my friend Pat asked me if he was overweight. So I said, yeah, you are a fat bastard, Pat. And he said, I'm extremely offended by that because I identify as a fat cunt, not a fat bastard. Um, so, and I knew that I could say this to him partly because of the relationship we have, but also because he's a guy. I would never have said that to a female friend. And I actually think that is, although the supportive women's mutual supportiveness, at least public supportiveness and in groups, can be a really nice thing. It's a double-edged sword because it can discourage you from self-improvement because your friends all tell you you're already great. Whereas the kind of more male thing of teasing each other and kind of the friendly put downs and things, that's actually can be really helpful because it can spur you to go and do self-improvement. And incels have kind of cut themselves off from that culture.
Yes. So some of them would still engage in Looksmaxxing. So there's levels to your inceldom. And I talked with my friend Mac and Murphy about there is a lot of research to show that women are prioritizing beauty in men a lot more in recent decades. And there's a lot of kind of triangulating evidence to that effect. So every second guy under the age of 35 is a recreational bodybuilder now. It's kind of like expected that you hit the gym to a pretty intense level. A lot of young men are using retinol on their skin, engaging in cosmetic surgery even, and a lot of just Looksmaxxing in general, engaging in more fashion. So that's kind of interesting. And women are just saying they value physical attractiveness more, which is kind of to be expected because the resources and the protection that men were usually selected for are kind of taken care of in different domains for women. So they're thinking, okay, I've got everything else. I really want pretty. Now, this could be a positive development because, like you say, men are honest with each other about how they might look smacks and they don't mind being sexualized. So if the male gaze probably really is hurtful to a lot of women in some ways, but it's definitely the female gaze towards men isn't going to be that hurtful. We don't mind. It's kind of fine to be sexualized as a man for the most part. But what is another feature of male psychology that might make this dangerous is the tendency to go to extremes. So men can be really extreme with anything, and that is what you're seeing with the Looksmaxxing. They're engaging in really invasive cosmetic surgeries, and you'll also have the greater male variability hypothesis. So some men will really go extreme and succeed in the game, but some will be left out entirely based on the physical attractiveness. So it's interesting to see which way it will go, but there's some features of modern culture that point to this effect.
So when we last talked about this, I remember we were talking about, I think it was with you that I was talking about Diana Fleischman's concept of fake fitness, which is that it's easier to abstain from being part of the dating market when you have access to porn, because when you're watching porn, you have an orgasm in the kind of presence, quote unquote, of a woman. Even though the woman is only on the screen, there's some part of your brain that tells you you've fulfilled an evolutionary purpose there. But I heard you recently in an interview say something I thought extremely astute, which I hadn't thought of before, which is that even if you have porn and prostitutes and maybe in the future even AI girlfriends and sex robots and things, so that in a sense your sexual needs, maybe even your romantic needs are being fulfilled, none of that stuff can give you status in the way that being chosen can boost your self-esteem and also give you status among your peers, knowing that someone else, a real person, chose you, as opposed to prostitution being paid or whatever, or being programmed as a robot, whatever it might be. And that status thing is, I think it's crucial to all human beings. I really agree with Will Storr on this. His book, The Status Game, which I highly recommend to everyone. I think it's important to everyone, but probably especially to men for good evolutionary reasons. So that's a kind of crucial thing that incels are missing, I guess.
No, I totally agree. And it's an important point because often when I discuss this topic, there's typically some midwit comment that says anybody with 200 bucks can just decide to no longer be an incel, or don't sex workers exist? And like you say, there's no status afforded to the guy who can only get sex by paying for it explicitly and transactional in that way. Now, it's probably better than nothing, depending on the sex worker they encounter, because there's probably a lot of variability in terms of the girlfriend experience from a really sophisticated, perhaps Ayla style escort who'll, really probably be convincing compared to maybe a sex worker who's really kind of desperate, just trying to get some money, where maybe the incel, having paid for sex with someone like that, will come away very aware of how disgust inducing they might be. It's not like a clear cut example of this is going to do your mental health wonders. It may, but it's a dicey game. But yeah, there's no status afforded to the guy who has the best sex robot, I can't imagine, or there won't be. So it's a fundamental component that kind of explains it. Yeah, so Diana's idea also, we wrote a paper on this called Why Isn't There More Incel Violence? And the first thing was to just contextualize the level of the violence. And it is kind of peculiar because in evolutionary psychology, we have what's called the young male syndrome, which describes if you have a surplus population of sexless young men, they're typically very status striving and very risk taking, because if you're on track to be an evolutionary zero, then you will take a huge risk to become a risk it all to win big, so to speak. That's why young sexless men, mateless men are easy to motivate to go to war, for example, ancestrally. So it's actually a puzzle why the increase in sexlessness hasn't really increased a massive spike in violence. And we hypothesize, as per Diana, that it could be what we call the male sedation hypothesis, that they're just pacified by these online worlds. And I don't just mean pornography, although that probably plays a significant part. Just the distraction of the internet in general. People are occupied by it in all sorts of ways. They play status games on it with video games. There's a lot of evolutionary needs being kind of met on there. And increasingly, people will probably occupy virtual worlds. So it becomes a question of the competing motivations, right? The status of being able to be sexually selected, or will people just retreat into this dystopian VR, ultra compelling, artificial, intelligent girlfriend experience? That could be pretty compelling to young men, because when we talk about this stuff, it's called supernormal stimuli, that some stimuli in the modern world are so potent that it kind of hijacks our evolved mechanisms. So the typical example we give is the male jewel beetle, which attempts to mate with the broken beer bottles outside of bars. And you might think about that and laugh and say, oh, a beetle could be so stupid. A human could never be so stupid. But then the average
Yes, it
man,
could.
it looks at a two-dimensional screen and watches pornography. And I wondered whether the incels in my data used more porn than others. And I looked at their porn use and it came out to about 4.5 hours a week. And I thought, oh my God, I've got such a cool finding here. They watch way more porn. But then I looked at the non-incel men in my sample and they would see the very same. So it's kind of like there's a ceiling effect that all young men seem to watch a lot of porn now. But it's interesting that might be buffering against real world violence, because it's a pretty controversial finding that the more pornography you have, or the more sex work, you have lower levels of sexual violence in those societies too. So it could be this pacifying effect.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you make of the extraordinary response to adolescence on the part of Keir Starmer and many politicians? Why have they leapt on this so strongly? And at this point, do you have any theories about that?
My more cynical side is maybe perhaps more conspiratorial and thinks that it could be like a catalyst to try and bring in some draconian, overreaching online safety kind of measures. It's always under the guise of for the safety of our population and specifically for the safety of kids. My more charitable interpretation is that he is just trying to piggyback on the enormous popularity of the show. And like you say, humans are very attuned to narrative. So he might be trying to galvanize a conversation on the back of that. I do hope, I heard one interview with Jack Thorne, the writer of the show, that he said it's very important to remember that this is fiction and we want to start a dialogue that includes, he described it as people a lot smarter than me, which I hope he means the research. And I hope that any further discussions that are sparked by the popularity of the show is evidence backed or based on the research, or do more research. It's very, very early days in this world. So I'm a bit disconcerted to see the rush to intervention and to show this in schools. There's actually a petition already garnering a lot of signatures. It's actually written by Jess Taylor, who you may recognize online, a feminist activist. And she highlights a lot of the concerns about doing this. So for one thing, it's a rated 15 show. So how's that going to work in schools where most kids are under 15? The show itself depicts schools as being massively overworked, burnt out teachers who can't control the students. And that is very accurate. Having worked in schools in the UK, they do a very good job of depicting that. But what's ironic is they depict one teacher, poor old Mr. Malik, as being completely burnt out. He walks in late with his shirt untucked, and he's lampooned in the show for being over reliant on showing videos to the students. And then the solution is we're going to show the video 4 hours with teachers who are as overworked as they show in Adolescence. That's realistic. We're going to ask them to find 4 hours in their curriculum to show this TV show and, I presume, build in additional lessons in response to it and manage the fallout from that, which is, who knows how students are going to react.
Hopefully not to just get out of teaching those 4 hours. Just be like,
Right.
I can relax this class just showing the video.
Well, I don't think they'll be relaxed because it's highly emotive and there's probably going to be a lot of emotions triggered, a lot of clamming up of young men feeling attacked and kind of lashing out. And it also has the problem of giving a lot more notoriety to this issue. So it takes the number of people who haven't seen the show from 0 to 100 overnight if you insist on showing it to everyone in the UK. But also with incel violence or mass shootings or these lone wolf attacks, they're in it for the notoriety a lot of the time. And there's evidence that they cruise for a cause before doing an instance of mass violence. So imagine if you've just shown a generation of young men who may be disgruntled and lacking in status, that if you commit a mass violence on this level, there'll probably be a Netflix show made about you. You'll be discussed in Parliament straight away. I mean, the one instance of incel violence in the UK with Jake Davison's case, they were showing his YouTube videos on Sky News. Like, if you're in it for the notoriety, that's a really dangerous thing, a precedent to set. So it could backfire really badly.
Yeah, it could be copycats. That would be the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
I did note that this is nothing to do with incels specifically, but there's been this kind of similar rhetoric and somewhat similar rhetoric and panic in Australia among the political classes about an epidemic of violence against women. We actually ran a piece in Quillette, which I'll also put in the show notes, by my personal friend Russell Blackford. He is a sociologist and he analyzed the statistics, and actually among Western countries, Australia is one of the ones with the lowest rates of violence towards women, nor have those rates increased. So, there's just like, there is no epidemic. There's nothing there. there are obviously women who have suffered violence, as with any country, and that is a serious problem. It's as though we can't tackle a problem without making it massively dramatic, because otherwise we're not going to prioritize it. So therefore we've got to big it up in this way. And
Yeah,
it's
that,
yeah, sorry,
that's very
go ahead.
interesting, but I think that piggybacks on our actual, I would suggest, evolved tendency to be very, very protective of women. And people say, oh, we live in a patriarchy that's dismissive of women, but actually there's a ton of evidence. I think actually in Quillette you might have published an article called something about the misogyny myth by Bo Weingard and Corey Clark, and it was full of evidence of our pro-female biases, particularly in areas of protectiveness. If you really want to kind of motivate people to back an initiative, you talk about how it's going to help women. And there's actually reasons why the incel topic specifically captures our attention. So I wrote to my former professor Alberto Acerbi, who he's published these cognitive attraction rules. And I remember when he taught me this in Brunel in London, I remember thinking, wow, my incel topic, that ticks all of these cognitive attraction rules. So there's a reason why the media salivates about this topic and why the show is one of Netflix's most popular within 17 days. So those rules are that it has to be about sex, it has to cue the perception of a threat, it has to be minimally counterintuitive. So ragtag group of online men who form their identity around sexlessness is kind of like, whoa, what's that all about? It has to activate your tribal psychology, that there's an other agentic group out to get you. It probably, he didn't mention this in his rules, but piggybacks on the greater protectiveness of females bias that we have. So yeah, it ticks all of these boxes. So that I'm hoping to write an article with him, because it's important to figure out why this topic garners so much attention, if it potentially is going to inspire other killers, if it's going to activate our politicians to just fall over themselves in paying homage to this program. It's important to understand why.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are good evolutionary reasons for being more protective towards women, and it just makes also just common sense,
Mm-hmm.
because women have less upper body strength. Also, women could be pregnant or being the caretakers of young children.
And they're
But
a more valuable reproductive resource as well.
yeah, eggs are expensive, sperm is cheap. But also there is always this danger of demonizing men, which is another concern that I have about the amount of attention that is given to the show, that it will cause either sort of a tendency to demonize young boys, or to be overly panicked and paranoid about ordinary male behaviors or ordinary behaviors among young boys
Yeah.
that
I
are,
remember there's a
yeah.
really good article in Quillette as well, I think, or maybe it was Ario, about men are not sharks. So remember this
Mm.
discourse that went around after the tragic Sarah Everard killing, which I think this kind of rhetoric reached a fever pitch, and people,
Yeah.
like, there was this cultural meme of, well, some men are dangerous and we don't know which ones, and it's the same with a shark. Kind of
Yeah,
really.
no, because you want to, it doesn't make sense to me for with a very large group like men, where the proportion of men who are violent towards women is, I assume, quite small. I assume that most men who are violent towards women are repeat offenders, and
Mhm.
therefore there is a mismatch between number of victims and number of perpetrators. Not like every woman who's been suffered violence from a man has suffered it from a different man. It's not like
Yes.
this.
And it reminds me also of the "this is why we choose the bear" meme that went
Mm.
around. Are you familiar with this one, Iona?
Yeah,
So there was
yeah.
this online meme of lots of women saying that they would plausibly choose to be alone in the woods with a random bear versus a random man. And this is ludicrous for a number of reasons, but one, it's really counterproductive. So I think there is a real cross-sex mind-reading gap about men underestimating how much women are fearful and how much they are upset by sexual violence or afraid of sexual violence. So I think it's really important to try and bridge that gap. But if you suggest that we take seriously women would prefer to be in the woods with a bear. That's very
I would not.
easily. No, of course you wouldn't. But that's very easy for sexist men to kind of retreat and say, oh, yeah, women, they always talk about they'd rather choose the bear. And it's kind of very easy for them to dismiss the genuine fear. So it makes bridging that cross sex mind reading very difficult. And it's just, are we suggesting that women are logically presenting the argument that I am so afraid of men that it causes my brain to be so illogical that I would dismiss 50% of the population as a group as more dangerous than a wild animal like a bear? Is that what we're suggesting? That's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
It's actually quite sexist.
Yeah. Yeah. I would probably rather be in the woods with a man who I knew to be a rapist than with a bear, because a bear will fucking disembowel me.
Yes, you might have some chance of kicking the rapist in the balls and getting
Yeah.
away, but
Yeah.
yeah,
You have no chance against a bear whatsoever.
yeah.
But I think it's always difficult to strike a balance between encouraging caution and having sympathy for victims,
Hmm.
and also yet encouraging resilience and discouraging
Yeah.
paranoia.
It just annoys me when this meme, it's kind of like Sam Harris, he says that, oh, it becomes a meme that's saying, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are black. He actually suggests that's probably a good heuristic to suggest someone isn't a racist
Yeah.
if they have black friends. It's similar when people say, oh my God, you're one of these guys that says not all men. I think it's totally appropriate to say not all men in this case when it's something specific as how many men are sexually violent or aggressive. I don't know how that catches on as this gotcha meme. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. It makes no sense to me. I mean, you cannot avoid risk in life. Life is your take life, you could die at any moment, and you are taking a series of calculated risks all the time. When you drive your car, that's probably much more dangerous than being on your own with a random guy.
Yes.
Um, one of the risks you do take is that inevitably you do have to put your trust in men. You are alone in situations with men who are much physically stronger than you and who could overpower you if they wanted to. And
Hmm.
you take that risk because you know that the chance that they will want to is quite small. And I think some people just the risk from a bear feels more acceptable, or the risk from a car accident, because it's just a random fact of the universe. It's not personally directed at you. Whereas risk of violence from another human being feels much more frightening to us, much more terrifying. So we watch horror movies that are about serial killers. We don't really watch horror movies that are about killer bears.
Yes.
The sense that there's a malign motivation there is that makes it more frightening. But
Yes.
nevertheless, it's still just one of many calculated risks that you need to take. Otherwise, you can't live your life.
Yes. In evolutionary psychology, we call it the shadow of sexual violence, that it kind of creates this overall general fearfulness among women. They're so afraid of, and it's so costly, sexual violence to them, that they perceive the threat of it almost everywhere. They have a miscalibrated fear of stranger rape versus the more actual threat of acquaintance rape, for example. But yeah, it's a huge fear that looms large in many women's minds. But it's very easy to prey on that fear
Although,
and be
yeah,
overprotective. So go ahead.
could I just say that maybe stranger rape would be more common if women didn't have a very strong fear of it,
Yes,
because we
it's
don't.
not clear whether it's miscalibrated, where it's an evolutionary mismatch, such that stranger rape was the more credible fear in our ancestral environment, where you lived among kin for the most part, and it's just a feature of the novel, evolutionary novel, modern world that acquaintance rape is more common. Or, like you say, it's precisely working effectively that stranger rape is so low precisely because women take these evasive measures. That's a really important point. But it's very easy for men or male society or society in general to prey on that fear and have the draconian overprotective measures. I remember a number of years ago, Jeremy Corbyn even supported the idea of bringing in female only train carriages, and just based on this fear implicating control measures. And that's precisely how Islamic men control women. They talk about, oh, the threat of sexual violence, it's for your own good that we don't let you out of the house, that kind of things. I know it's a slippery slope, but it's very interesting because it's quite controversial, and I can't remember which specific radical feminist it was, maybe Camille Paglia or someone like that, that said true freedom for a woman is the ability and freedom to risk being raped. And it's quite a kind of a shocking statement, but it makes sense because it's this threat of sexual violence is such a fear for women that it's very easy to control women by saying, oh, well, anything to avoid that, don't go out of the house, so to speak.
Yeah, so is there anything that I haven't asked you that you feel we should have talked about, or anything we haven't underlined with regard to the series that you think is important, or with regard to the reaction to it, or incels in general?
I think we've kind of covered it all, but this story is moving so fast and staying in the news cycle so much that there'll probably be 10 different talking points on it by the time this airs. But I think we covered quite a lot. And yeah, I think we've got enough for your listeners now.
Thank you very much, William. Well, in the show notes, I'll put all the details of where to find you and your work. And yeah, it's been a great talk. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, thanks for having me.